college freshman Scott Damerow, Larry, set a new world record by using his head to bust 142 eggs, and he now officially holds a place in the Guinness Book of Retards. In my opinion, if you're going to fight the war on terror, a good place to start would be this nation's haunted houses.
I've never asked you this before, and we've been good friends for many years. Okay, I made that up. But
no. We haven't?
No, we're friends. We're good friends. But I don't know what your... McDonald, is that Irish? Is that Scottish? What's your ethnic background?
My ethnic background is Polish.
Are you really Polish? Wow.
Polish people,
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
McDonald, you don't...
Well, my parents changed their names. They had to because of the constant ribbing they'd get for being Polish, you know. And so they changed their name to McDonald. But, you know, it's one of the things that you can, you know, I mean, I get a little upset about it, you know. Because, you know, you
all the
can't...
Polish jokes and stuff.
You can't make jokes about other people, but for some reason you make jokes about Polish people, you know?
Right.
I don't like it.
Right. You shouldn't. That sounds bad, yeah.
I mean, I had an experience, you know. I go in and I order a Polish sausage, you know, from this guy, you know. And so the guy says to me, you must be Polish. And I said, come on, man. I mean, come on. Think about it, what you're saying. You know, I'm trying to knock some sense into this fellow's head, maybe give him a wider world view, you know?
Sure, yeah.
I said, you think because I order a Polish sausage, I'm Polish. I said, what if somebody came in here and ordered French toast? Would you think he was French, you know?
Right.
I mean, what if somebody came in here and ordered a Belgian waffle? Would you consider that guy a Belgian, you know? I mean, if a guy came in and ordered a German bratwurst, would you consider that fellow to be a German fella?
Right.
I said, what if a guy came in and ordered German potato salad? I suppose you'd think he was German too. Yeah?
Yeah.
You know, what if a guy...
Wow, you talked to this guy for a while.
I'm telling you, man. With racists, you have to get through to them.
You have to really get it into their head. Right.
I said, if a guy came in and he ordered a Cuban hamburger, are you going to assume he's a Cuban?
Right.
I said, I think it is absolutely ridiculous that just because I come in here, I order a Polish sausage, why would you jump to the fact that I'm Polish?
Right.
And the guy says to me, well, first of all, it's a hardware store.
And you hate Polish jokes, don't you? You just hate them.
No, I think they're disgusting.
Was that the original, sir? This is a Wendy's.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome, everyone, to Read Out. I'm James, one of your hosts, and joining me as per our usual arrangement, we have John and Christian. Today, we are going to be diving into biblical critical scholarship, doing a bit of a deep dive, as it were. But before we get into all of that, John, how are you, sir?
Good. Happy to be here. Not drinking anything too special. I have an Accelerator cotton candy, which should keep me going for the rest of the stream.
Excellent. And I see you've done something with your hair.
Well, I've removed it, so if that's doing something with it, then yes. Yes, I have indeed done something with it.
This is, I saw it on one of your focus ship streams, but I haven't had a chance to ask you about it. Is there any particular story behind that? Did you lose a bet?
No, I've been bald before, actually. If you go back to my channel, like videos 10 years ago, I was also bald back in college last time. Like, I think 8 years ago was the last time I shaved my head. But no, I had a lot of hair. It was very, very long, and I decided I didn't like it anymore. It's summertime, and so I just shaved it off. Had a bit of a Britney Spears moment, you know? Mental break, and then afterwards, I'm like, oh, that was a bad idea. Not really. I think it's fine.
All right. Good deal. All right, Christian, how are you, sir?
Doing well, man. Doing well. Nothing much new in the realm of my world.
Excellent. Are you in class right now? Or when does that start?
Not this Tuesday, but next. It's first day.
All right. Nice. Mm-hmm. Well, very good. What are you drinking, sir?
Just my sparkling water, man.
There you go. All righty. I am drinking 10th Mountain, named after the 10th Mountain Division. It's a Utah bourbon. It is quite tasty. It is only 92 proof, which is pretty low for what I normally drink in the stream, but I figured we had a pretty dense collection of concepts to get through, so it'd be helpful if I was actually sober for the entire time. So I thought I'd start out with something a little slower. If you don't mind, before we jump into the topics and some of my opening remarks, drop us a like if you are watching live, and go ahead and subscribe as well. We are very, very close to hitting that 1,000 mark, and it would be awesome to get over that this week. So please do subscribe if you have not already done so. Share with all your friends. Tell them all about it. Alrighty. So today we're doing a deep dive into biblical critical scholarship. I say deep dive. There's really, largely we'll just be scratching the surface because there's just so much to get into, and we just can't get that deep in an hour and a half or 2 hours, however long we'll spend on it. But as deep as we can go, we'll cover a lot of the main concepts and focusing especially on the assumptions and the presuppositions of this type of scholarship. And by way of introduction, I guess I wanted to give a bit of a warning. A couple things. One, this is an area that if you ignore, you ignore at your own peril. If you never look into biblical scholarship at all, then you are liable to be challenged by someone who has and not have answers. We've talked about this in a previous stream, but it doesn't take very long for someone to do a little bit of research and find some questions that if you've never looked into biblical scholarship, you won't have answers to about certain apparent contradictions within Scripture, certain historical challenges that people will make, assumptions that you make that you don't even realize are assumptions, like the authorship of the Gospels, right? You assume that it says the Gospel according to Matthew. Why do you assume that? Well, because it says the Gospel according to Matthew at the top. And then you look into it. If someone asks you, well, does it ever say that Matthew wrote it? Does he say that he wrote it? Is it like one of Paul's letters where he says, I, Paul, wrote this? No. Gospel of Matthew does not, at any point within the Gospel of Matthew, indicate that Matthew wrote it. And so if you didn't even realize that that was an assumption you were making on the basis of tradition and well, basically, if you didn't understand the structure that holds up that assumption, then it will be very easily challenged and may cause you to stumble. So ignore at your own peril. However, the funny thing about biblical scholarship is, and sort of the sad thing, is the amount of edification from this particular study is unfortunately very low. There is very little spiritual benefit, very little even historical edification that can come from this, as I have found it, because so much of it is just riddled with awful presuppositions in terms of just how they conduct the history, what assumptions they make when determining what to include and what to leave out, and how to make their judgments. There are good, solid Christians doing biblical scholarship, even in a critical fashion. They are fewer and far between as time goes on. It is an area that needs solid Christians to dive into it, but it's very, very hard to engage in because the assumptions, the presuppositions of the field are so often antithetical to what I think we would consider true Christianity and the assumptions that Christians must make. And so academia tends to shun people who think differently. It promotes a certain amount of conformity, and so it becomes very, very hard, and it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling or a self-creating problem where it perpetuates these bad presuppositions. So ignore at your own peril. Wade into it with a little bit of trepidation. Realize that this is something that's going to be a little bit. It may be new, it may be different, it may challenge some of your preconditions. However, the flip side of that is you can, once you've done kind of a base level of research and understand the presuppositions that are going into the critical scholarship, you can pretty safely dismiss it all. You can pretty safely dismiss a vast majority of the critical scholarship that's being done, because again, you don't really need it for spiritual edification. And once you understand how flawed the methodology is, you can even in good conscience and being have solid intellectual grounds to simply just sort of wave it away and say, yeah, this isn't really all that interesting or all that important for me to study. to be a well-informed Christian and a consistent thinker. So it does take that initial level of looking into it, but once you understand how the field works, then it really can be dismissed pretty safely. So that's all I want to say in terms of opening remarks, because we're going to actually dive into the details. Before we get into that, though, I thought there were a couple miscellaneous things that happened this week that might be fun to cover. First off, of course, we had a giant golden statue, not the calf from the Old Testament, but a different subject being instantiated in statue form. John, do you have that story?
I got it pulled up right here. So this was in Mar-a-Lago, so at least it's not on the White House. Maybe one step too far, I suppose. But MAGA evangelical leaders, like I continually forget her name, but we've talked about her before. The head of the Faith Council, Paula White, yes, for the Trump administration. Those types of people gather around to bless and dedicate a gold statue dedicated to Donald Trump at his Mar-a-Lago resort, and this is just footage of the event itself. I don't know, just it gives me Old Testament, getting out of Egypt vibes. It's just a little strange. People say that MAGA people might be in a cult, and I'm just saying every day that goes by, there might be a little bit more validity to that statement.
I think I saw a comment. It was like, I wonder if they melted down all their gold jewelry and made the statue out of that.
Yes. Yeah. It's it's perhaps not the best look. I do think it is funny. This is all put out by the only people that were there, as far as I understand, were, I think, Jews and evangelicals. I don't think there were any Orthodox or Catholics in attendance. However, the justifications that the evangelicals, or at least some of them, were giving as for why this is not idol worship or why this is not in any way bad, were very much the kind of arguments that you'll hear Catholics and Orthodox make about iconography or veneration, and the difference between proper respect and worship. And I'm not really seeing a difference in argument. I think that they're actually correct. It's like, yes, the optics are bad, but in principle, is there a problem with blessing a statue of your leader? Is there a problem with setting up a statue of the leader? We have statues of all kinds. Is the problem that it's gold? Well, Trump famously loves gold, and it is on his property. Mm-hmm. When you pick at any particular issue, it's like there isn't actually any problem here. It's just that the optics look kind of bad, and we don't really like golden statues because of the golden calf. Am I missing something? Is there anything else that makes this bad?
Yeah, it's the combination of things, right? Yeah. Because it's like we have statues of generals and presidents from days past, and that's all good. That's all honky-dory as far as I'm concerned. When it's a golden statue specifically, yeah, Trump loves gold, but then it's being actively blessed by evangelicals and, Orthodox Jews on the lawn of your opulent resort in the middle of a war while gas prices are soaring and inflation is wrecking the economy and whatnot. Oh man, it's just optically so bad. Yeah. Principally, it's not terrible to have a statue of a president, of course, but optically it's so bad.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what you mean by blessing. If you're just, I don't even know what that means in an evangelical context. Like, put your hands upon the statue and pray for it or something.
I don't not blessing the statue, but blessing, asking for God's blessings on the country and on the person who was being.
Wait, are you saying that the honor given to the statue passes to the prototype and it's a representation
exactly.
of the country?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
I got you.
I don't think this follows very well with the recent iconography of Trump being a Red Cross doctor or whatever. So,
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
well, at least he doesn't look like Christ in this one. At least he's not on a cross. That would be bad if it was.
Yeah,
it was
how
Trump
funny would it be if he has the robes? He has the robes on. He has the pierced hands. He's like, no, but I'm a doctor. Just have pierced hands for a reason. Don't worry about it.
All right. So yes, this was a silly bit of drama that happened over the weekend. What else do we have? There was this Christian? You sent that post about an Orthodox church advertising baptisms on their website for the low cost of $250.
Well, so
John,
there's more to this story that I was just looking up.
Yeah.
So apparently it's not really what it seems. So Band Pastor, who just had the debate with Jay Dyer that we covered last week, posted this. Baptism is only $250 for Orthodox. Apparently these are for specific special ceremonies that are not on the normal times. So like this is for a private baptism, like a private wedding or a private event that you would pay for. So the standard cost for a baptism is $0, or in the Orthodox tradition, as I was just cycling through their Twitter. Sorry, I forgot I didn't have it on screen, but this is the post itself, right? Baptism fee, $250.
Right.
Some of the private services go up to $1,000. There were some people posting Orthodox church websites that had it listed for $1,000. But if you go in there, it's like for some of these people, they're claiming it's a ceremonial fee almost to kind of like reimburse the church for the thing.
I'm sure they're not making a profit off of baptisms.
No.
Yeah.
And I mean, to me, this is also weird optically.
It is very weird optically.
Yeah. Although I get it if it's like a private event, because like you're like a church might allow you to use their facilities for a wedding or something, but they're probably going to charge a fee just because, maintenance, cleanup, and all of that sort of stuff. And I don't think there's any issue with that.
Not only that, there's materials associated with it as well, like getting fitted for a baptismal robe as well. That stuff ain't free. So.
Mm-hmm. Right. But just optically, like if you're baptizing people into your church, I think the assumption is that they will become members of your parish and then tithe. And so like a baptismal fee doesn't necessarily make all that much sense. Although, again, a lot of the Orthodox people that are talking about it are saying like, we never paid for it. Usually there are people within the church that sponsor the baptism, so they actually tithe like an additional amount for the baptismal fees, so they're always covered for people who want to get baptized.
But even that's odd, right? It's like you should just have a fund set aside for things like this. I mean, yeah, you're right. If it's like a special kind of baptism,
Protestant,
maybe,
but I've never seen a Baptist church that I've been a part of ever even endorse a fee. It just comes out of like the general fund,
not for stuff like
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is pretty common even in the Catholic Church as well. I think like even at the cathedral in Salt Lake City, it's a mandatory donation of $1,800 for a wedding. So it's pretty on par with other.
It does remind me a little bit of the fact that I don't know how it is in the Orthodox community, but in the Catholic circles, as I understand it, certainly just talking to my own Catholic friends, tithes are not. I mean, the way Catholics view tithes are that it's basically just you have to donate a certain amount of your money to probably spiritual causes, but I'm not even sure that it has to be directly spiritual. But it certainly doesn't have to be to like the church that you're attending. Whereas in Protestant communities, generally speaking, at least the ones that I've always grown up in, donations to random faith-based organizations were not considered part of your tithe. It's like you give 10% to the church that you're attending and that you're a member of to help cover its expenses, and then if you wanted to donate other things to other to pregnancy support services or things like that, that was fine, but that wasn't like part of your 10%. And so there was sort of an expectation, and not everyone upheld this, but the expectation is that the congregation is all giving 10% gross income to the church. So it might have something to do with that. Whereas if you're in a community that doesn't sort of expect a certain amount given to the church as part of the tithe, then you might have to ask a congregation more specifically for particular events. What's been your experience in terms of tithing, Christian? How do Catholics or even Orthodox, as you're kind of exploring, how do they view tithing?
In the Catholic Church, it's pretty much relegated to like 10% is kind of the norm. At least at the Orthodox parish I've been attending lately, it's pretty much whatever you're able to give within reason. There's no really a set amount. Every parish, I think, is going to be different depending on the main priest, but yeah.
And in the Catholic circles, would you give that directly to your church, or would you give that to just give it away, or what was the
It'd be
where's the money have to go?
Church.
Directly to church, okay.
Yeah, you could just write a check and put it in the basket when the ushers go around. Gotcha. That's typically how people would do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's very similar to my experience as well.
Yeah.
John, what about you? Were you raised sort of in a what are the tithing practices where you grew up? John, you're muted.
I was trying to make sure the video clips I was pulling up weren't playing on the screen. But anyways, it's been pretty straightforward for me. So it's always been just hey, you should be giving 10% and you should also be. But I mean, like in youth groups and stuff like that growing up, they were also trying to incentivize you that it shouldn't just be this like empty monetary promise. It's more of an act of sacrifice. You should be giving time. You should be doing this. It's not like, okay, I tithe my 10%, get it, like you're done, you're clear, you're now even with God and you can go about the rest of your day, basically. Right. It's more than that. You need to be honoring him with the other 90% as well that you still keep. So that was kind of what I was taught growing up in like more Baptist circles.
Alrighty. So let's dive into the main course here. Before we do, I want to I'll share my screen real quick. Call out just a few resources that I used in prepping for this, so you can follow along or review them at your own leisure in the future. So a couple things. So one that I recently reviewed. So this is, again, it's just my works cited. It's where I have all of the various sources that I have consumed in my study of theology and philosophy. So specifically for this, some things that I've been pulling from are this. Let's see. Covenant Theological Seminary has a class by David Chapman. This one right here, New Testament History and Theology. I've got the link here. And this is just an excellent class. It's about 26 hours if you listen to the whole thing, but there's a few lectures in particular that dive into basically critical historical scholarship on the New Testament. And this class is a great complement to a class by Bart Ehrman, which is much shorter, but is very similarly titled. Let's see if I can find that one here. Thought I had it. There we go. Bart Ehrman's class, just the New Testament. You can find this one on Great Courses website, or Audible has it as one of their great courses. And this is an overview of the New Testament taught from a critical historical perspective. And Bart Ehrman is a very famous critical historian, specifically focused on the New Testament and the Bible more broadly, but mostly on the New Testament. And he is a professor at UNC, so just down the road from where I am here in North Carolina. But you'll see him all over the place, and we'll actually play a couple clips here later today. But if you're interested in someone who is sympathetic to all of this scholarship, giving their case, this is a great overview. Very short, consumable 30-minute lectures. And then if you want a more robust response, then the David Chapman series is great. If you could only do one, I would do the David Chapman one, because he covers the both sides of the issue. It'll be from a more he's coming from a traditional Christian perspective with Christian presuppositions, but he is engaging with the scholarship in a way that a lot of Christians don't. A lot of Christians just sort of ignore it completely, and he's actually engaging with it in a respectful manner, which is really helpful. There's also from Covenant Theological Seminary, one of their free resources is this 2-hour seminar that they held on the historical Jesus. And this is basically, we'll get into it a little bit. There was this thing called the Jesus Seminar, which met in the 1980s. And about 200 scholars got together and put together this, basically their own version of the Gospels. And they went through and they basically determined what they think, which words of Jesus were the authentic words of Jesus, which ones could be relied upon historically, and which ones didn't. And basically, to cut a long story short, they were like, only 18% of the phrases that Jesus is supposed to have said can we reliably rely on as being historically accurate. And so got a lot of press at the time, and in the weeks after it was released, after the findings were released, Covenant Theological Seminary put together a panel of 5 different speakers who came out and talked each just for about 20 minutes, and then they had a little Q&A at the end. And this is all released in this 2-hour lecture. And yeah, it was again helpful for just seeing the discussion around it and the presuppositions that went into it. And we'll discuss that particular seminar in a second here. I think that's it for now. I'll call out any other resources as they come up. Okay. So, if I can start with a brief overview of the history of biblical scholarship, and just call out a few names that are going to be important and that you may have heard before, but try to put them in some context. So the first figure that's worth talking about is a man named Friedrich Schleiermacher, which is kind of a fun name. And he, let's see, I can pull up a picture of him. Just share some Wikipedia information.
I got it for you.
You got it. Perfect. So Friedrich Schleiermacher, he would have lived in the turn of the century, the 1700s to the 1800s. And what you're going to see with him is he's considered the father of liberal Christianity, and which is quite an ignominious term. So he is not respected amongst your traditionally minded Christians. But in terms of critical scholarship, this is the guy. He is the guy who started it all. And he would be really trying to reconcile the Enlightenment and sort of the scientific findings of the Enlightenment and this modern age, this age of modernity, when it was assumed that science was going to answer basically all of our questions. He was trying to figure out, okay, well, how can we still keep, some semblance of Christianity that actually is real and that means something? And so he's a major figure in that discussion and in kicking off this thing that we now call liberal Christianity, which is in fact not Christianity. Fast forward a little bit to Rudolf Bultmann, who is most famous for, I believe, his work, the history or the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, as a phrase you'll hear. And essentially, Bultmann was enamored with Hegelian dialectics, and so he would view Christianity through this dialectic framework, where he would look at like Paul and James and see you have thesis, antithesis, and they come together in a synthesis. So Paul, his view of faith, not works, and James' view of works based salvation, and then they come together to sort of make the more orthodox perspective. And you would see all of kind of Christianity as being that falling within this dialectic. Or another example would be Jesus and Paul, right? So you have Jesus' teachings and you have Paul's teachings, and they sort of synthesize to make this new Christianity, this synthesized version. So he was enamored with the dialectic. He was an existentialist in many ways, and so he's going to be viewing this through much more of an individualist perspective. If you're familiar with existentialism as a philosophical school of thought, it's really hard to define or pin down existentialism. Existentialism includes people like Nietzsche and people who very often are characterized by a certain amount of nihilism or promoting a certain nihilism where everything is meaningless because it's just so individualized. But also people like Kierkegaard, who was really trying to convert people with his philosophy to Christianity because he was trying to make Christianity more personal and more real, because he was living in the Netherlands, which was a Christian nation at the time, quote unquote. But he looked around and he was like, no one here has any kind of a personal relationship with Christ. There's no, Christ is just a social phenomenon. Christianity is just a social phenomenon that has actually no bearing on their their actual personal actions or their faith. They don't really have any personal faith at all. Christianity is just something that they do and don't do particularly well. And so existentialism has both of these sides. It has sort of a Christian side and it has an atheist side. And Bultmann would have been in the Christian side, but he is buying into a lot of these modern assumptions about basically all of the truth claims that Christianity, that the Bible makes, are really won't stand up to scrutiny and should basically be rejected. And so we have to have a new way of thinking about the Bible and about truth, sort of separating truth from facts. Another figure would be Adolf Schlatter. This is another, he was a German Lutheran. So far, all of these, I believe, have been German. And Schlatter would have been, he's one of the few German theologians of this caliber, that has had this great of an impact, that was conservative, that actually held to a fairly traditional view of Christianity and of biblical truth and infallibility, and even something approaching inerrancy, although we'll get into what inerrancy means, and that term really is much more of a U.S. evangelical term in many regards. But Schlatter would have had a much more traditional perspective. He would have argued very strongly that the theology of Paul was in fact the theology of Jesus Christ, that they were not, that Paul didn't bastardize or create his own version of Christianity. And he would have been really fighting against these perspectives in many regards. Another figure that you will hear talked about a lot is Karl Barth. His name is spelled B-A-R-T-H, but in where he's from, it's pronounced Bart, not Barth. And he is going to be the father of neo-orthodoxy, or at least a key figure in that movement. And Barth gets misconstrued very often. Ultimately, his mission was to combat the liberalism of Schleiermacher, but he couldn't. He bought into so many of the assumptions of the liberals, and saw that the end result was this sort of nihilistic Christianity where nothing actually really mattered, but you just kind of comforted yourself with the truths of Christianity. But then once you died, it really didn't matter. So it's just sort of a kind of an opium for the masses, really. And Bart didn't buy into that. He didn't like that. But he bought into a lot of the assumptions about the Bible not being sort of factually true and not really being reliable in that sense. And so he was trying to take a very Kantian background. It was very much from the Kantian school of philosophy, and trying to forge a new conservative orthodoxy that could still be very loose in terms of biblical truth, but didn't lose its Christianity. Some would say that he was successful. Many would argue that he is not. I don't think that he was particularly successful, and unfortunately, he is impossible to read, in my opinion. He just says so much without saying anything, and it's painful. At least the little bit of Bart that I have read. Perhaps he's more clear in some of the works that I haven't read. But that is the neo-orthodoxy movement. Neo-orthodoxy. It's trying to counter. It's a conservative reaction to liberal Christianity, but done so in a way that really accepts a lot of its core presuppositions. And he would have been challenged. So that's all happening in the continental Europe. In the United States, in Princeton, in the I guess what is this? Let me get my timeline straight here. Yeah, so at the turn of the century, kind of the early 1900s, you're going to have the Princeton theologians like B.B. Warfield, and then under him, J. Gresham Machen, who would be warriors for a more something that was starting to form this sort of idea of biblical inerrancy. Now, that term developed more officially later, but really focused on reaffirming the idea of Scripture as laid out by the Westminster Divines in the Westminster Confession of Faith, and this rigid view of Scripture as being infallible, but also inerrant, and can be relied on in all of its truth claims, both factually and spiritually, and literally, morally, all of it. B.B. Warfield was at Princeton, as was J. Gresham Machen, but eventually Machen left to found Westminster Theological Seminary, where a more kind of robust concept of biblical inerrancy continued to develop, and eventually was codified in the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, which we'll get into at a future time, because biblical inerrancy is really beyond the scope of what we can talk about today. It's just it's a topic in its own right. But let's see. So that's just a high level overview, and but I wanted to highlight sort of some of the differences that are happening in Europe and in the U.S. And I know that I haven't covered all of the different faiths. Pretty much all of this is happening in Protestantism. However, the other, Orthodoxy and Catholicism are being significantly affected by these discussions, to the point where Catholics today, and Orthodox as well, have bought into much of Christian liberalism on one side, whereas you will have the more radical traditional Catholics and very traditional, conservatively minded Orthodox today, espousing views that are very similar to sort of these Westminster ideas of biblical inerrancy, even though the more official statements you'll see on these, the really hard, concrete statements that you'll find are going to be primarily penned by Protestants, because because I guess there is Protestants have had more, because there's more leeway in the Protestant sphere you can be a legitimate Protestant and think about these things differently. It's kind of forced Protestants who disagree to come together in somewhat synodal fashion and put this stuff down. Whereas you will find statements within Catholicism on inerrancy, but even in penning down exactly what this means is very difficult, because you will find Catholics who will, in theory, uphold the statements that have been infallibly declared, but will, in practice, some will side much more with an inerrancy perspective, and some will side much more with a non-inerrancy and downright liberal perspective. Okay, I think that's enough in the history. John, Christian, any thoughts so far? Have you heard of these figures?
Very briefly, this is not like a great area of study for me in any way, shape, or form. This wasn't really part of my history growing up, so to speak. Right? This very aggressive, inerrancy debate. Like, the one nice thing about growing up in very Baptist fundamentalist circles is that this conversation literally never comes up. Right. So you sidestep all of this.
It's just completely taken for granted. Yeah. That is the fascinating thing, and it's a good thing, but it can also, like I said at the beginning, it can be a trap if you've never challenged it in your own head. Okay, so I want to move on to the Jesus Seminar. Mm-hmm. Let me share my screen again. Let's see. Let's do the window. There we go. All right, so the Jesus Seminar, a group of biblical scholars met in 1985. I'm not sure for how long they met. I don't think it lasted that long. Like I said, they concluded that about 18% of Jesus' sayings and 16% of the actions in the gospel were likely authentic, which is kind of the eye-opening Cliff Notes version. in terms of the methodology, so yeah, they published as a result of it the 5 Gospels, and of course the 5th one is the Gospel of Thomas, which they included as being legitimate in terms of its historical value, or just as legitimate as the other ones. They were not interested in canonicity or accepting the early Christians' understanding of canon. And then they published another one called The Acts of Jesus and the Gospel of Jesus. So they had these 3 publications. The method that they went about in terms of determining whether or not something was authentic in terms of what Jesus would have said or done was by vote, basically. So it's just a collection of, I think, 200 some scholars, and they would have their debates. And then at the end of the day, they would just vote on whether or not they would, how they would rank it. And the rating system, they kind of had, how in like the Bible, in some version of the Bible, you'll have red letters for what Jesus said. Well, they would do something similar where they would have red for sayings that they think were truly authentic, pink for ones that they said were possible sayings, gray for ones that they thought were close to his voice, but didn't have the same historical legitimacy or authenticity, and then black for things that they thought were almost certainly not something that Jesus would have said. And these are all quotes from the Gospels, or they would also be including in this analysis lines from the Gospel of Thomas. So an interesting concept, I suppose, but not particularly profitable for your fundamentalists. And of course, there were no fundamentalists present, because the presuppositions of fundamentalism would have completely countered anything that they were doing. And by the way, fundamentalism as a concept, or as a term, is one of those things that developed kind of beside the what people were doing in like the Princeton theologians and the Westminster theologians. Their project would have taken on the term fundamentalism, but that term came about through other means. I think it was popularly applied to a group. It was like 5 principles of fundamentalism that someone came up with. I forget who, published in a newspaper, and it kind of caught on. It was just things like the virgin birth, and 5 other just fundamental views, the deity of Christ. And the idea was, if you believe in these things, they were saying this is just the fundaments of Christianity. But then there were all kinds of other people who were calling themselves Christians, these liberal Christians, who wouldn't affirm any, and certainly not all, of these 5 fundamentals. And so this term fundamentalist was kind of thrown at these backward thinking Christians who were just upholding the basic truths of Christianity, and not even like necessarily the most important. It's not that these 5 things were the essential doctrines. It was just, these are 5 things that any true Christian should affirm, but many people who were calling themselves Christians didn't. So it wasn't a comprehensive list in any way, but it was just, it was a good litmus test. And so even though that list was not developed within Old Princeton or within Westminster, it would have been something that was that they would have sort of reluctantly accepted as a title that became popular and was helpful in terms of how they might label themselves. With some caveats, but it wasn't something that they applied to themselves. But these days, that's you'll hear the term fundamentalist, and that's it still holds much of the same connotations for both sides. All right, so the Jesus Seminar. Can you guys still see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, so these 7 rules, these are the 7 presuppositions that are laid out in the introduction to one of their publications. These are the principles of how they see, scholarly, they would call these principles of scholarly wisdom when discussing the historical Jesus. And again, they're following this old tradition, this tradition that goes all the way back to Bultmann, if not before, of separating the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith, and assuming that the Gospels are not historically accurate records. So principle 1, distinguishing the historical Jesus from the stories about him in the Gospels. So what I just said. And then favoring the synoptics over John. So the synoptic gospels, that term refers to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which all read very similarly, have very similar formats, and in many ways, in many passages, can be nearly word for word identical. You can set them side by side, and it looks like one of them was copying the other one's homework. And so this led to an assumption that Mark was used as a source in Matthew and Luke, which were presumed to have come later. And so these three gospels are seen to be essentially all kind of one source. Source criticism goes a little bit deeper. We'll get into that, some of the presuppositions there a little bit later. But these were all kind of grouped together in the synoptic gospels. That's what they're called. And there would be a preference for the synoptic gospels over John, which was considered to have come later. Now, a large reason for the assumption that John comes later is because John seems to include some prophecies that would have already been fulfilled, and therefore they can't give him credit for supernaturally predicting things. And so you put his dating as being after, like, the fall of Jerusalem, for example. That's not the only reason to date it later, and some people think that it's legitimate to date it later, but certainly they would assume that it came in like 90 AD, whereas I think Mark they would put at like 60 AD. And so these are some of the assumptions they're making, and they're going to prioritize the synoptic gospels over John as being more historically accurate, whereas they see John as being much more theologically driven in his accounting. And John does seem to differ in some ways with the synoptics in terms of some of the details, and so they would prefer the details of Matthew, Mark, and Luke over the details of John, especially where they are different. And if there's a story that they find in John that they don't find in the other ones, then they would be quicker to toss it out. Identifying Mark as the first gospel, like I said, that's another assumption. Acknowledging the hypothetical Q document, the source of material found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And so Q, the theory is, if Mark is used as a source in Matthew and Luke, well, what about the stories? Because they're assuming that none of these people, I should have said this first, but they're assuming that none of these people were eyewitness accounts, right? Matthew isn't written by Matthew, and so it's written by someone who has a source that he is, Mark in this case, that he's writing these stories from. But what about the stories that aren't included in the Gospel of Mark, because Mark is much shorter, that are included in Matthew? Well, he must have his own source for those, and they call that source Q. So for the stories that are contained in Matthew and Luke that aren't contained in Mark and that are shared between Matthew and Luke, those would be from a hypothetical source Q. And the designation Q just comes from, I think the word for source in German starts with a Q, and that's where they got it from, or something along those lines. Interestingly enough, there are also stories found in Luke that are completely unique to Luke. And those, they would say, those came from a source, because they couldn't have come from Q, those would have come from source L. They just designated L. And then the ones from Matthew that aren't in Q and aren't in Mark and aren't in Luke, those would be from source M for Mark. I'm sorry, M for Matthew. And so now you have source Q, Mark, L, and M. These are your four sources that you're pulling from, and three of these are completely hypothetical, and only one of them is an actual gospel. So this is where you're pulling your information from. So you're reconstructing these sources in this very backward fashion. Questioning the eschatological Jesus, rejecting the view of Jesus primarily as an apocalyptic prophet. This is interesting because this is actually something that would have been challenged by critical scholarship prior to the Jesus Seminar, and even after the Jesus Seminar. This has been one of the more contentious points, even amongst biblical scholars, because people like Bart Ehrman, who we'll talk about in a little bit, would very much hold that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, that was kind of his main role. He was someone who was talking in apocalyptic, he was talking in that genre. He was one of many prophets that were somewhat common in that time. There were many other apocalyptic preachers at the time, and you can go back even to the Old Testament and see certain prophets using this genre of apocalypticism. That's not right. I can't figure out how to make that noun. But who would be using this genre of prophecy. And so they would just throw him amongst all these other teachers. And then at the time of the Jesus Seminar, it was becoming a less and less prevalent view that was sort of the main thrust of his argument. And so one of their presuppositions would have been to eschew that concept of him being an eschatological figure. And so anything where he's making eschatological prophecies, they would put that in gray or black because they saw that as being less in keeping. That would have been a later addition by Christians who were more apocalyptic in their thinking. So again, just another sort of rather baseless assumption. Baseless isn't doing it justice, but I'm just telling you it's rather baseless. And especially to be a fundamental assumption when that point in and of itself, even amongst critical scholars, was very much in question. And then 6, distinguishing between oral and print cultures. So essentially, they would say that oral cultures tended to remember things that were short, pithy, easy to remember, right? And so whenever you have a long text in any one of these gospels, if it's like a long speech, clearly no one could have remembered the entire speech, so that probably wasn't actually said, especially anything in the middle, like maybe at the beginning or the end, maybe that would be an accurate statement, or maybe a couple statements in between, but you couldn't just take any random sentence from a long speech and assume that was, unless you had other grounds for assuming that was true, you couldn't assume that was authentic because who could write down word for word a long speech. And so that's that preference for, or that distinguishing between the oral cultures and print cultures. And then finally, reversing the burden of proof, requiring evidence to support authenticity rather than requiring proof of inauthenticity. So again, that's where you get to that 18%, where they're not saying necessarily that Jesus didn't say any of these other things. They're just saying that there's no historical grounds for assuming that Jesus did say those. So they're assuming that Jesus didn't say anything until they can show with the use of this criteria that he did. There you go. There's more that went into this in terms of the presuppositions, but these are the 7 rules that they lay out in the introduction, and I think that's a helpful overview. It just gives you a flavor for the type of scholarship that they're doing. John, Christian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean it's fun to jump into and look at it. To me, it's always strange, I suppose, coming at it from the Christian perspective. I get it from the atheist perspective, right? Because they don't believe in anything supernatural. But it's always strange to me from the Christian perspective, where they're like, this just seems so unlikely and improbable that any of this, that this Bible could be accurate in any way, shape, or form. And it's like,
right.
Your worldview is quite literally supernatural,
right.
And you don't believe like they could remember a speech, like
right.
That's the hump for you to get over right now, not the whole creation of the universe and heaven and hell and angels and an omnipotent God. Like the Bible, though, that's really hard for you to accept as something that a a creator of the universe could maintain through time. You think that's
Right.
the
That God could shepherd his creatures into creating this document. I mean, I think from a Christian perspective, part of the challenge is that we don't believe that Scripture was just sort of, very, very few Christian sects and none of the major ones believe that the apostles just sort of went into a trance and just, wrote down by dictation what they were receiving directly from God. And so you do sort of have to account for, well, how could they have recalled these statements? Or at least how could they do so with perfect accuracy? Is that simply, do we just assume that that's miracle, that is what's inspiration, even if they weren't receiving it directly from the, by dictation from the Holy Spirit, they just tried their best to remember and God allowed them to remember correctly. You could believe that many Christians of Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant faith would say that even that is perhaps too simplistic of an explanation. And so you do have to start to engage with some of this and ask the question of how, if we do believe that this is factually correct, and to what degree do we assume that these are factually correct in a precise way. In other words, if the gospel says Peter said this, and let's say it had, it didn't have quotation marks, but we put those in. It does sort of, it says he said this, and then it says what he said. What if he said something slightly different, but had the gist? Is a paraphrase a lie? Would the author be misrepresenting what Peter said? Most Christians would say no. It's okay if some of these statements are paraphrases. But even then you start to think about, what about some of these longer passages? Are these long paraphrases? You would hope that, they weren't just sort of writing their own versions of speeches that Christ made in the way that some historians around the same time would have done with other figures, and even explained that that's what they were doing. Now, other historians that are also contemporaries would have condemned that method. So there were multiple kind of schools of thought around how to properly conduct history and how to recreate speeches that were delivered, and how to record those. Some would be more in favor of just long paraphrases, and others would say, no, you should try to talk to the sources and get it as close to correct as possible, or don't record it at all. But there is a practical element to what I'm trying to say, and I think as Christians we do have to engage with that if we are going to hold to anything less than sort of divine dictation, which again most Christians do. We hold to something less than exact divine dictation. Does that track? Are you guys following?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. It's not like the Holy Spirit itself like grabbed their hand and forced it to the page, right? There's some sort of divine guidance involved, but how specifically that works, we're not entirely sure, right?
Right. All right.
Do you mean to share your whole screen?
No, sorry, I didn't, but I did want to check it on the chat. Is there anything interesting going on here? Let's see.
Well, Shadow Force has the real question. He's just glad that they all spoke English back then.
That's right.
Makes it way easier for us to read.
I think right. Owen wanted a link to your all your references that
to the article.
Yeah, let me throw that in the private chat, and John, can you
I can put that in the chat for all of the
official chat.
Wonderful people down there. Something I think we'll probably get into it, but something I did find interesting about going through all of Bart's lectures on this topic, or at least a selection of the lectures on this topic, is that they always discredit the earliest Christian sources, and they look for antagonistic sources and place those in sort of like a higher echelon. But I'm not sure if we do that for anyone else or anything else. Like the only person that records Genghis Khan's early life is, I think, his brother, right? And I don't know if we apply the same level of textual criticism. And I'm not even saying that it's unfair to question his brother if he's actually accurately denoting this imposing figure's life, if we even know that that's accurate. But it does seem that we don't hold all historical figures to the same standard that we do when it comes to the Bible and to Christ himself, right? Because of course, if you discount the earliest Christian traditions and writings and all of that, well then you're left with a couple Jewish sources that name him a couple of times in the first centuries, and then you have pagans writing about them in the second century. So it's like, but like why would they be writing about Christ if we discount his followers writing about him, right?
Right. There is, so there to your first point, there is definitely a bias or it is an unfair scrutiny placed on the words of Jesus that is not placed on basically any other historical figure. The method that they go about is certainly prejudicial against Christ's followers, against Christians, against the people who are saying that we're kind of shepherding the words of Christ. Now, an honest biblical scholar would probably admit to that, but they would simply say that, well, when you are combating the extraordinary claims, it requires they're allowed to resort to this type of criticism. In other words, yes, we wouldn't apply the same type of criticism to Genghis Khan's brother, because we would just assume that Genghis Khan's brother is probably pretty prejudicial. He's probably prejudiced in favor of Genghis Khan, and so we can't believe that everything that he wrote about him is true. All right, case closed. We don't, and no one is really claiming that Genghis Khan is the Messiah and the
right. There's no supernatural claims about him, right?
Exactly. So they don't need the same kind
by
of
the way,
criticism.
this guy's the messenger of God. You'd be like, oh, well.
Then people might be like, well, wait a second here. Now let's dig into it. And so, that's the response. But I think that if you were to apply these methods and these critical assumptions about pretty much any other figure, you would arrive at some pretty odd views of of our history. Basically, you would have to toss out so much of what we consider to be historical about so many figures if you were to apply these standards about Christ to other people, right? If
well, to your point earlier, I think it necessarily leads you to like almost a semi-nihilistic, like you have to throw out almost all of history as far as I'm concerned before like what, the 18th, 19th century? Because even before then, there's going to be very sketchy references and like if we have to find, you know, people who are antagonizing like 16th century philosophers, then it's like, oh, well, that's not going to be as easy to find as people might think. So I mean, we do have to toss out like almost all of our, you know, Western interpretation of history, basically.
It would make having an understanding of history of the story that we have told ourselves about the world very difficult, right? So even if you apply the same kind of thing to Julius Caesar, you know, who was written about a fair amount, I would think, right? Major world figure, and you know, probably more than Jesus in some regards, although maybe not to the same degree in the same like the same degree of personal accounts, right? Jesus, you have these 4 accounts, although some would say it's more like 2 or 3 if you're going to group all the synoptics together. But you have these kind of personal accounts of Jesus doing things, whereas with Caesar, you know, a lot of our accounts are going to be more like Suetonius writing more like tabloid rumors that he heard and things like that. It's not going to be quite as personal. But if you were to do the same kind of analysis and you come away with like, oh, we can only be sure of like 18% of the things that we know about Caesar are true, that radically changes how you view history. It's like, yes, maybe I can't have a perfect epistemic certitude about my concept of Caesar, of Julius Caesar, but I do have a good grasp of who he was, I think, and I have good reason to believe that that's relatively accurate. And now throw in, on the Christian side, applying this to Jesus, throw in an element of supernaturality, where it's like God could make these things that we assume to be true or assume to be factually accurate in the case of all these other historical figures, that God could preserve this history in a way that it is actually perfectly true. It's not that great of a leap to go from the level of common knowledge that we have about other historical figures to a much more heightened, much more perfect knowledge about Christ. It's not nearly as much of a leap as I think a lot of critical scholars would try to make it out to be.
Well, even to your point about Julius Caesar, I think that's something that came up today. Was it Plutarch? Was that the other guy of his time? But Plutarch and the other historians of their time, they actually take stories of him and place them at different points in his life for like narrative reasons, like they're telling a story. So like even that stuff you can throw out, if that is your standard, you can throw out most of his life. But it's like obviously we know he's real.
We don't even do
all these things, but it's not really relevant to the discussion in any way. Like it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't make it any less true because he put this one event like here and this guy put it here. It's like it doesn't change the actual event itself.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's the Jesus Seminar. That's sort of the idea of the historical Jesus, the quest for the historical Jesus. This is a quest that has been done many, many times over, right? This is by the time you get to the Jesus Seminar, you're on like the 3rd quest for the historical Jesus, where people have kind of taken up the cause and then it sort of fell back as being maybe not that practical, and then they take it up again. And so that it was the Jesus Seminar kind of presented it as if this was something new, and I think it was new to a lot of people at the time, but this is really a very old form of study, and it was a very tired field of academic scholarship by the time they actually put this stuff out. But it did definitely, I think, had an impact on a lot of Christians. I think a lot of people bought into much of what they were saying. All right. Let's play those Bart Ehrman clips. I put 2 in the chat, John, if you want to pull those.
I got them pulled up. So which one should we start with? What is the title of this one? Will biblical scholarship destroy your faith?
Yeah, do that one first.
Okay, perfect. We'll do this one first.
Not destroy faith. It doesn't need to destroy faith. It does not destroy faith. It doesn't need to destroy faith. There's no reason it needs to destroy faith unless your faith is a fundamentalist faith. You may not think you have a fundamentalist faith, but if your faith is that you've got to believe every word of the Bible or you can't be a Christian, then you've got that's a fundamentalist belief, whether you consider yourself a fundamentalist or not.
I mean, that knocks out all Catholics, all Orthodox,
right,
and probably 80% of Prots. Well, all real Prots, no evangelical. It's like that's everybody, bro.
Bart will do this thing where he'll in his undergraduate courses he'll do this, or in the courses that the resources I share with you guys. He will do this thing where he's like, now I'm just coming at this from a historical perspective. This is not, a faith-based class, and really what I'm saying shouldn't challenge your faith at all. It might challenge some of your preconceived notions, but really it's not. I'm not trying to attack anyone's faith. I'm just showing you the historical perspective. And then he'll go on to say all these things that directly conflict with and are in direct tension with the vast majority of Christian beliefs, right? The way that we go about understanding the scripture is, he is saying, from a scholarly perspective, ruled out. And so he'll do this thing where he's saying that you can still have your faith, and believe in what he's saying, and buy into the facts, the historical facts that he's presenting. But as long as that faith is a very, very restricted type of faith, really, it's sort of a liberal version of Christianity. He'll talk about, he's like, I have a pastor friend, an evangelical pastor friend, who basically believes all the same things I believe about the Bible, and he's a Christian and I'm not. It's like, the reason I fell away from Christianity is not because of this biblical scholarship. I was a biblical scholar for about 20 years while I was a Christian, and then I eventually fell away, basically because I couldn't deal with the problem of evil. This is his testimony of why he fell away from Christianity. He'll say it has nothing to do with biblical scholarship, but the way he's presenting the Bible and the history of the Bible is directly contradictory to the fundamental tenets of most Christians. And so I think it's a very, very dishonest way of going about this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I think biblical scholarship can certainly change faith. It can mature faith. It can make faith more knowledgeable rather than ignorant, and so that's good. And it can lead people to be more open-minded about the world generally, which can lead to a loss of faith. But I don't think the scholarship itself is going to destroy faith. It does not.
Yeah, I mean, that seems kind of slimy to me, right? Because he's like, listen, once you're not ignorant about your fundamentalist faith, it doesn't necessarily, destroy everything that your faith is founded upon, but it might in some cases.
And
there's
people have a lot of respect for Bart Ehrman in the scholarship realms. Even the Christians won't tear him down in terms of his scholarship. So he probably has done decent scholarship, whereas basically working from these presuppositions, his results kind of check out, which is all that's required to be a good scholar. But he's much more than a biblical scholar. He is a professor of undergraduate students, right, which are not getting into the scholarship. They're just kind of getting these high-level overviews and having their faith challenged. And he's a popular, essentially, apologist for this methodology. And in those areas, he does not deserve your respect. He does not go about it in a way that is at all respectable, in my view.
Mm-hmm. All right. The next clip is, should errors kind of the same vein here, should errors in the Bible cause you to lose your faith in Christianity? Obviously, he's presupposing the errors, which we'll probably get into in a little later.
Right. It's not playing on our end.
Oh, my bad. Sorry. I do not have this. I was listening to it all right, not realizing it was not on screen. Hello? Can I move you back? Thank you.
It's the contradiction and the mistake in the Bible, the errors, just flat out errors, geographical errors, historical errors, scientific errors. That tends to lead people away from an evangelical point of view once they realize these really are errors. But I do want to be clear that none of.
So what do you think about that? Because I think what he said there might actually be correct. if all you have is a sola scriptura, like solo, I'll be fair, I'll say solo scriptura, right? So all you have is the Bible. It must be perfect scientifically in every way, shape, or form. And any errors that somebody points out because they watched some Reddit tier atheist in 2015 put up a couple counter arguments that you couldn't deal with. I think that will actually lead people away from something like evangelicism, where that's all you have.
Yeah.
Is the text.
The reason I picked this clip in addition to the other one, because they're very, very similar clips, but I think that technically what he says in this one is probably correct. Again, you're correct that he is presupposing the errors, which I don't think is a fair presupposition, but assuming that there are errors in Christianity, that should not negate your faith, right? Assuming that there are errors in the Bible, that the idea of biblical inerrancy should not be the sole basis for your faith in God, and even in the Christian God and in Christ, which I think is an important concession for Christians to make, because otherwise. Oh, did we really get to 1,000? Oh, that's awesome. 1,000 subs. Because otherwise that would, it really puts you at risk. And it forces you to basically close your eyes to all versions of biblical scholarship, and makes you look very, I guess, kind of common in your Christianity. It just looks like you're not willing to engage honestly. You're not really willing to do the work to find out the truth. You're just kind of going about it with sort of a blind faith, and I think that isn't good. And so there are plenty of reasons to presuppose inerrancy, but many valid Christians don't have that particular standard, or wouldn't claim that particular title, but still believe that the Bible is entirely true, is entirely the Word of God, and hold to it. And so there is sort of a lower standard of what is required in terms of a valid faith, that does not necessarily rise to this technical definition of inerrancy, which, like I said, and we'll get into it a little bit, that is primarily a American concept, at least that's how it has been technically defined. You will find versions of it or statements that look very similar in the other groups, but they're not universally held. In Catholicism, it's definitely not universally held, and in Orthodoxy, they are going to be really, they will say things that sound very, very similar to what Jordan Peterson says when it comes to how he views Scripture being true. In fact, there was a book that the Christian recommended to me by an Orthodox apologist, and it was a helpful chapter on kind of how Orthodox, or at least how this Orthodox would read Scripture. And one of the statements he said sounded very similar to the type of explanation that Jordan Peterson would say about, is this passage true? Very similar type of analysis, which is why I think you'll see people like Jonathan Pageau, who's a Orthodox apologist who will go on Jay Dyer and talk with these people, is very friendly. Is also very friendly with Jordan Peterson. He will say very similar types of things in terms of sort of the symbolic meanings and the symbolic truth behind these biblical stories. And I think that he does hold to probably something deeper than what Jordan is saying, but it might not be. I doubt it would rise to that level of like strict inerrancy.
Well, and something that I would like to say as well is to anybody in the chat who ever has questions or concerns, because I did at certain times when somebody would point something out that I hadn't thought of before, and that would kind of like, okay, well, now I got to go back to the drawing board and kind of reason out my position. There are a million great apologists that have done great explanations to all of this stuff, so don't be afraid to just say, I don't know, and then go look it up or ask questions about it, because it's not a problem at all.
Yeah.
That led me away from being a Christian. Once I realized the Bible had contradictions and mistakes and other things, I continued to be a Christian for probably 15 years. I continued to be a church-going, Sunday school teaching Christian. And so this kind of biblical scholarship, I don't think, is the sort of thing that should lead somebody away from their faith, unless their faith is just that the Bible has to be inerrant, or I won't be a Christian. And if that's your view, you got a very strange view of Christianity. I know a lot of people have that view, But that is not what historical Christianity ever was. But it's the contradiction.
Right, to posit. So that is true. That should not be your view of Christianity. That's putting the cart before the horse. The reason anyone who holds to inerrancy should hold to inerrancy because you believe that the Bible is the Word of God and God would not put errors in it. And that's why you believe in inerrancy, because you believe in God. You don't believe in God because you believe in inerrancy. And so in that regard, I think Bart Ehrman is actually correct, that if your view of Christianity was built fundamentally on this one presupposition of inerrancy, it would be an odd form of Christianity, and it would not stand up to scrutiny, and certainly not. It would not be a historically justified perspective to start there. People who believe in inerrancy get to inerrancy through a series of syllogistic statements flowing from their understanding of God and how the Bible was conceived. All right. Let's see. What's up next? We're making pretty good time here. So I wanted to give a high level of some common concepts and vocabulary that you're going to hear when it comes to biblical scholarship. So we talked about the different types of criticism. So there's 4 especially that are worth addressing. There's text criticism, there's source criticism, there's form criticism, and redaction criticism. So text criticism is going to be fall into 2 categories: higher text criticism and lower text criticism. Higher text criticism is going to be the type that basically allows for much of what we talked about today in terms of the presuppositions. It's going to be the type that maybe looks at rejects canonicity and looks at the Gospel of Thomas as a valid resource, even though that was rejected by the early Christians. One that looks at basically, higher text criticism does not come from within a set of Christian presuppositions, whereas lower text criticism is not in conflict with higher text criticism. The 2 can go hand in hand, but lower text criticism is also not in conflict with a more traditional view of Christianity and of the Bible, in which case you're looking at the text and you're trying to you look at the oldest manuscripts that we have, whether those are just clippings that we found in trash heaps in Egypt, or some of the early scrolls or larger documents, some of the codex. You're trying to basically determine what the autographa, what the autographs said, the original text of Scripture said, because we don't have any of the autographs. We don't have any of the original documents, right? We don't have the original letters that Paul wrote.
The original letter of Paul, yeah.
All we have are copies. We have copies of copies of copies of copies. Now, these were carefully written copies, but they're copies. And the thing about copies is you'll find errors in copies. And so there will be actual errors in the things that we have that we're getting Scripture from. And so we're trying to work backwards from these copies to figure out, okay, you compare 2 copies and you see an error in this one and the error is not in this one. Okay, then we go with this one. But sometimes you're not always sure what the error is. So if you have 3 or 4 and only one has the error, then you know that's the outstanding one. But if you have only 2 and you're not sure which one is an error, then you've got a problem. And so these types of issues are what lower text critical scholars will deal with. And this is like Wes Huff is very much involved in this area of study and does a very good job. And this is actually profitable. This is why the versions of the translations of Scripture that we have today are so freaking good. You can take 2 or 3 translations of Scripture and read them side by side and get an almost perfect idea of what the original text said, or at least our best guess with all of the weight of academia thrown behind it. And it's actually really, really good. And so assuming some of the later translations have actually been corrupted by another concept in academia of like basically just gender studies and gender critical theory and whatnot, where they're actually trying to degenderize Scripture. And so they'll rather than saying using man for all of humanity, they'll say like people. They'll try to like degender some of these concepts. And so the newer versions of the NIV, if you just look up like a NIV on your phone app or something, it probably will be a version that has been degenderized, which actually can create issues of meaning. It's not just a sort of a grammatical difference. It actually changes the meaning in some places, or makes it more ambiguous. And I think the ESV has held out, but there are a couple other ones that have made that change. So, but in general, especially if you're looking at some of, before those changes happened, so like the NIV version that came out in 1984, that version is still solid. But NIV and ESV are actually pretty similar, I think, in their methodology. But you can look at a few different translations that come from slightly different methodologies in terms of how they go about doing the translations. Because there's you can translate in phrases, or you can translate in word by word, essentially. So you can kind of take a phrase in the original Hebrew or the original Greek, and you can say, let's just rewrite this phrase, including sort of the rewrite it in somewhat more modern language. So you'll take something that would have been a colloquialism, and you'll sub in a similar colloquialism that might not be the exact word for word meaning, but it is close enough. Or you can do something that is much more word for word that will sound awkward when read in English, but is closer to the original. So there's different methods in terms of how you handle that kind of thing. So, but if you take a couple different ones that hold different methods and then read them side by side, you will get a great sense for even the types of decisions that the translators had to make, because you'll read one that has it slightly differently from the other one, and you'll start to see like, oh, I get why they made it sound a little bit cleaner with this phrase, and then these ones are trying to stick to something that sounds a little bit more awkward in English, but actually is probably closer to the original one. But I understand now how they're similar. Anyways, the translations we have are very, very good, and largely thanks to lower text criticism. The one sticky point is lower text criticism is also, I think, still responsible for the types of omissions that you will see in many modern Bibles. So in other words, it is an area, it is the consensus amongst most scholars, even faithful Christian scholars, that the end of Mark, the longer ending of Mark, was a later addition, because we do not find it in any of the earliest manuscripts, and it seems like maybe monks, after the original one was written, sort of looked at the other Gospels and sort of penned a conclusion to the book, just to make it, to fill it out, to make it sound a little bit nicer. Or the story of the woman caught in adultery who is brought before Christ, and they want to stone her, and he says, "Whoever's without sin, cast the first stone." That's not found in the earliest manuscripts. It doesn't appear. I think the first one where it appears is like maybe the 4th century. I'd have to go back and look at that.
Right. So that section is probably added later on, which is funny.
A lot of people think that it's
one
added
of the
later.
most quoted sections as well. So
Right.
That's actually kind of funny.
But that one especially, and I think the end of Mark as well, I believe are both canonically, infallibly declared scripture by the Catholic Church anyway. Certainly that story about the widow or the woman, and I think the longer ending of Mark as well. It's funny because the end of Mark, actually, there are 2 possible endings, one of which we know like for certain is not correct, and then there's another one that is, I think the longer one is the one that we have good reason to suspect is not original, but many Christians still accept it. And that, interestingly enough, that ending is the one that includes like snake handling and some weird things. So some Christians will avoid it specifically because they feel like it leads to all kinds of bad practices. But these are passages that have been largely accepted and liturgically used and preached on by Christians throughout history. And so this school of text criticism, even lower text criticism, does cause us to question certain passages like that, which is going farther than many Christians would be willing to do. They feel like, well, once these have sort of been accepted, we should just keep them, even if, it's more dubious. It does seem like maybe they were added in later, we'll just assume that the Holy Spirit was guiding even those editions, or we'll just sort of look past the scholarship and say, no, we think that there's enough reason to think that they were in the originals, even if there's some evidence to the contrary, and we'll just kind of go along with it. So anyways, that's just one of the sticky things that comes along even in this lower, more traditional view of the form of text criticism, which has been going on since, Erasmus, and really even before. I mean, Jerome would have engaged in some form of text criticism, even if he didn't have, the tools that we have today. But all in all, this is an area of scholarship that should be respected and should be appreciated, because it has genuinely contributed to all of our lives in producing the very readable and accurate translations that we have today. So that's text criticism. Source criticism is what I was talking about before, where you're looking at like Q and M and L and Mark, and you're saying these are the four sources of the gospel, and maybe you also will look at the Gospel of Thomas, and so there's another gospel like T, and T was pulling some from Mark, but also pulling from, or the Gospel of Thomas is pulling some from T and some from Mark and some from other. Anyway, so that these are all very, very theoretical. They're very abstract. They're very much constructing these theoretical sources from what we have, and largely rejecting the testimony of Christians, right? It basically assumes that early Christians weren't honest brokers and honest, what do you call someone who, custodians of Scripture. And so you have to, reconstruct these sources because you're rejecting the testimony of the early church, right? If the church has ascribed, or declared that Matthew wrote this gospel, then that is actually evidence to believe that Matthew wrote it. If you assume that the church is an honest broker of truth, is interested in telling the truth about these stories, then that should be considered evidence in favor of Matthew being the author of Matthew. And that's one of the things that you'll see when you listen to like Bart Ehrmans' lectures. He'll say things like, there's no evidence. We have no evidence to believe that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. It's like, well, no evidence is a little strong, don't you think? You have no evidence that you're willing to accept onto the table, but there's lots of evidence of early Christians talking about these things and coming down on the side of, yes, we think, so-and-so wrote this, or we think that this should be accepted on this grounds. I mean, largely the reasons why many of the books in your New Testament were accepted into the canon were on the basis of who the church thought wrote them, right? The reason why 2 Peter was accepted was because they genuinely thought Peter wrote it, the apostle Peter, right? And Bart Ehrman will just reject that entirely and assume that someone else wrote it. It's like, and say there's no evidence that Peter wrote it. And there may be some evidence against it, but to say that there's no evidence for it is completely rejecting the testimony of the church. Which is just it would be like reading the history of Julius Caesar only from the perspective of the barbarian hordes who were conquered by him. You think you're going to get an honest account of him? Probably not. Maybe you can take that into account while also taking in the historians who are writing about his life, and then you merge those, and maybe you get some form of truth. But you can't just toss out anything that's sympathetic to the person you're writing that you're studying as being historically inaccurate and not even accepted at the table. So source criticism is riddled with issues. It can generate some helpful insights, but lots of problems therein. Form criticism is analyzing the form of the source. In other words, oral versus written would be two different forms. There could be others as well, but those would be the two main forms. And basically they're trying to assess which of these sources could have been written and which of them would have been oral. So I think Q, M, and L and Mark are all presumed to be written. But Q could have also come from a previous or multiple previous oral sources, and they're trying to look at those and again looking at which statements would be more likely to be remembered orally. Some of these short little pithy statements, which one? Anyway, so it's even more theoretical. And then finally, redaction criticism is the fourth big area of criticism, and this is going to look especially at the things that the authors left out. So if you're assuming that Matthew used Mark as a source, and Matthew does not contain a story that Mark does contain, then you're saying, why did Matthew leave this story out? So what did Matthew redact? All historians are redacting things, right? They're not including everything. I mean, John even says, if I was to write everything that Jesus did, it would fill up, all the books in the world couldn't contain it. So, we all admit that redaction is happening. But redaction criticism specifically looks at what did they leave out, again, assuming that we have the sourcing correct. And then it uses that to try to get a sense of what was Matthew's individual message that he was trying to get across based on what he didn't include. If you assume that he had this source and left it out, then he must have had a reason for leaving it out. What would that be? And so then you're speculating. Again, very, very speculative, and ends up you have a far too basically the data point. You don't have enough data. You don't have nearly enough data to actually make any kind of a true assumption about these questions that you're delving into, because you're left with such a small sample size of things to indicate intent, that it just does not give you a clear enough view of what their intent actually was. You're making gross assumptions. So those are the key types of criticism. Some of the historical criteria, so this is moving into another section of just historical criteria that are used to assess the whether or not the words of Jesus are real, for example. This is slightly different from the list that we talked about in the Jesus seminar, but these would be more broadly applied to all of the New Testament writings. Contemporaneity would be, which one came earlier or earliest, right? So that's why Mark is generally favored in terms of its being historically accurate, because it's seen as the first gospel. So the earlier writings are seen as being more accurate. I think Thessalonians might be the first letter that's written is the assumption, and so that's seen as being perhaps a little bit more historically accurate. So you'll look at the earlier writings, and the same when you look at the church fathers or even the critics, you'll see what was written earlier as being more true, which makes sense. Multiple attestation would be you want multiple independent sources confirming the same thing. But of course, remember, in the view of source criticism, you don't count the synoptics as being three sources necessarily. If you find the same story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then you assume that Matthew and Luke got it from Mark, and therefore that's actually one attestation that is not a multiply attested story. So that's another criteria. Contextual credibility. This would be looking at sort of what do we expect to see in first century Judaism, what would we expect a first century apocalyptic teacher to be saying, and does it line up with what Jesus said? If it doesn't, then maybe we should throw that out on those grounds. That one actually kind of contradicts this next one, which is the most controversial. It's called discontinuity or dissimilarity, and this basically says that the things that we can rely on most are those elements of Jesus' teachings that would not have been made up by Christians later because they actually go against something that Christians would have wanted Jesus to say, or same with like something that Jews would have said, something that is very different from what Jews were saying before. There's no way they would have made this up in their context, and so it must have actually been something that Jesus really said. And this one, it kind of makes sense if you are being completely skeptical, but it does again lead you to all kinds of assumptions where you're now assuming that Jesus, who was a first century rabbi, wouldn't have said any of the normal things that a rabbi would say in addition to some of these other things. It's like there's so much that it leaves uncertain. All that you can really get to with this criteria is the idiosyncratic Jesus. You can't get to the historical Jesus. You can get to perhaps a list of things that Jesus said that are different from what Christians would have come up with on their own, and what early Jews would have been saying, but that leaves you with very little. You have maybe 6% of Jesus, and you actually are leaving out all of these other things that Christ really did say, which is why Christians hold to them, which is why maybe the reason that Christians believe in some of these things is because Jesus actually said it, rather than vice versa. Jesus said it because Jesus is said to have said it because Christians believe it. So that's the criteria of discontinuity. We've already talked about, I'm just looking at some other concepts that I just think are worth being familiar with. In terms of, I talked about how, all the Gospels are technically written anonymously. Like none of them make within their text claims about who wrote them. Those are all assumed later. I think for good reason, but it is, the Gospel of Mark doesn't say that I, Mark, wrote this. So just something to be aware of. And that's another thing that most biblical scholars will assume that they, because of that, they probably didn't write it, which affects the dating of when they put these. It affects all kinds of things, and it affects the historical reliability because they assume that these are not eyewitness accounts. In terms of the Pauline epistles, they actually will divide Paul's epistles into 3 different categories. You have the undisputed Pauline epistles, you have the disputed Pauline epistles, and then you have the pastoral epistles. So the undisputed ones would be like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, I think 1st Thessalonians, Romans, and there's a couple, Galatians, there's a couple others. And then the disputed ones would be Ephesians, 2nd Thessalonians, and there's maybe one other. And then the pastoral epistles are Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy, and those are assumed to be, and I guess Philemon as well. Those are assumed to not be from Paul. Those are later people sort of assuming Paul's name to give them extra weight. And so the reasons why they make these assumptions, for the disputed versus the undisputed, a big reason why they will question the legitimacy of the disputed ones is on the grounds of it having a different theme, essentially. So like if you look at 1st Thessalonians and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st Thessalonians, and this is just a ridiculous analysis, but I'll just lay it out for you. The argument goes, 1st Thessalonians is talking to the Christians who in Thessalonica who have had some deaths in the congregation. And so it's talking largely along eschatological grounds. It's trying to lay out a case that these dead are actually going to be among the first to be risen when Christ comes back. And then, so it talks a lot about the resurrection of the dead, and it talks about, that Christians should, live as if the end were near and be expectant. And then 2nd Thessalonians complains that some of the people in Thessalonica are taking that teaching too far and living as if Christ is coming back, and they're mooching off the rest of the congregation. They're not going out and doing their job. They are living as if like some Christians today who hold to a view of the rapture, like Christ is going to come back anytime. It's getting so bad. And they just kind of stop working. They just expect like the rapture to come any day. You had some first century Christians in Thessalonica acting similarly, and Paul is saying, don't do that. Like, go to work, do your job. You still have to live your lives and live in godly ways. Scholars will look at these 2 different themes and say, oh, because one is saying live as if the end were nigh, and the other one's saying don't live as if the end is like that nigh, that these can't be written by the same person. They were probably written, a generation apart, which is ridiculous, because it's quite possible that Paul's initial message could have been taken too far, and Paul needed to write a second later to, correct the overcorrection within the church, which is not at all beyond the realm of possibility. And but you'll see rationality like that being used to dispute some of these epistles. The pastoral epistles are largely dismissed on grounds of vocabulary, where they use words that Paul they seem to use words that Paul didn't use in his other letters. If you look at the vocabulary that Paul had when he wrote the primary epistles compared to what he wrote in the pastoral epistles, they seem to have a different working vocabulary, and you'll find a lot of words that are only used in those that are not used in Paul's undisputed works. And some people will say that it looks like these are probably written by a different person or different people. And that is a more compelling argument. However, these letters weren't all written in the same year or in the same sitting. And I think if you read back on something, a paper that you wrote in high school, and then something that you wrote this year, you're probably going to find a pretty different working vocabulary. And just different topics will lead to totally different word choices. And so those sort of stylistic complaints are they're not unreasonable, right? This is largely why people dispute the Pauline authorship of Hebrews, even though most people in the early church thought that Paul probably wrote Hebrews, whereas today it's the consensus, even amongst Christians, is that Paul probably didn't. And no one's quite sure who wrote it. And this has been a debate throughout church history. This is not a new debate at all. The reason why we do that is largely on stylistic grounds and vocabulary grounds, where it doesn't look like Paul would have used this style. It doesn't quite read like Paul. Some would say that it does, but most people agree that it doesn't quite read like Paul. A similar argument is being applied to Titus and Timothy. I don't think it's as strong of an argument, but that at least has a little bit more legitimacy, but still does not, it doesn't overcome the testimony of the church saying, no, we actually believe that Paul wrote this. We have good reason to believe this, and we confirm Paul wrote this. This is why we're accepting this into the canon. And you shouldn't just toss that out. And some of these small details of like, this seems a little bit suspect. It's like, okay, seems suspect, but still not nearly suspect enough. And so the weight of your which side you err on is going to largely determine which side you fall onto. All right, I got to take a drink of water. I've been talking for too long. Stop me from monologuing, John.
You have been absolutely going at it. Perfect. No, I'm just sitting here like I'm in class. It's been like 8 hours of lectures today. What's a couple more? It's good. All right. Well, I think what's up next after this is going over some of the, I suppose, more typical quote-unquote contradictions within the Bible. There was a series done by Inspiring Philosophy like years and years ago, going through each one of these one by one. So in my own research and going through some of these, I was like, oh, look, there's another video directly on this topic that's like a 4-minute explanation. That's really useful. So if you guys ever have questions, you should go check those out, as I find them very useful, very easy to digest, all of that sort of fun stuff. Is there anything else that we want to talk about on textual criticism before we move into that section of the show?
No, except I just want to make a point that the rest of my points really fall into more the discussion of inerrancy, and I think that is a topic for a separate stream. So I'll save that. But I do want to get into that, and I think there are a couple. Those will not feel nearly as lecture-like, because there are some actually very interesting prompts and things that we can, specific instances that we can look at to refine our view of what inerrancy actually means and to what degree of inerrancy should be held to. So, topic for another day, but is definitely an interesting sub part of this discussion about scholarship.
Perfect. So if we get into some of the discrepancies, I suppose we'll start out with the big one, which is, I believe, the synoptic versus John's account, or timing, I should say, of when was Jesus actually crucified? When did he die? One of them says it's in the 6th hour. The other one says it's in the 9th hour. Why is there this 3-hour discrepancy between Mark and John? Now, as James mentioned earlier, there's the more standard scholarship would say that John was written much later than the other Gospels, late 1st century. I don't know if I buy that. I think it makes a lot more sense being written between 60 and 65 AD personally.
Yeah.
Even Revelations makes more sense if you earlier dated than that. But regardless of the actual timing of the writing of the books themselves, there's a couple answers to this one. So there could be that Mark was writing to a Jewish audience who is using the Jewish time scale, which starts the day at 6 o'clock in the morning. That is the 1st hour of the day, 6 o'clock in the morning. Whereas the Roman time, where John is writing to more of a Gentile audience, starts at midnight, which is the standard time that we would use now. That's kind of the generic explanation, that also leads into some other issues because that means that John is earlier dating some of the trial period beforehand, because he says that also happens at a slightly different time, I believe.
And perhaps more importantly, how do you deal with the Last Supper? Was the Last Supper a Passover meal, or not? So have you heard about this part of the controversy?
No, I don't think I've gotten to that one yet.
So the synoptics basically pretty explicitly seem to describe the Last Supper as being a Passover meal. However, when do we celebrate the Last Supper? Typically, we celebrate the Last Supper on Maundy Thursday, right? That's when Christ washed their feet. When it comes to Easter season, right? It's Thursday. Christ died on Friday. That's the way John tells it. And John pretty explicitly lays it out this way because he just Christ is the Passover lamb, and so he describes them eating the meal on, I think, the day of preparation, or right, maybe he died in the day of preparation. I forget exactly how it works in terms of the normal Passover time schedule, but basically, John's gospel pretty clearly has them having the Last Supper on the day before Passover, when the Passover meal would have been eaten, whereas the other Gospels seem to describe it as happening. That was the Passover meal. It's like Christ was like, "Oh, go prepare for the Passover meal," and then they all ate the Passover meal, and that's when the Last Supper happened. So, I mean, basically, it's like maybe it was just a Passover meal. Maybe it's just a meal that they were having as part of the Passover celebration, but not like the traditional. I think Seder is what it's called. The official sort of Passover meal, that's fine. That more or less solves it for me. But I'm not sure if there's a more clever way to do it, or if you've heard of that part of the controversy.
No, I hadn't gotten into that one yet.
But then it's like a whole different day,
right?
Because that also affects when you think Christ died. Like it's not, did he die before Passover officially, or did he die after the meal?
Well, because it moves it forward or back one day, depending on you read it. Right. Yeah. Some of the other stuff that I was looking into is that back in that time of the world, it was just, that time of history, really, it was just well understood that time does not mean the same thing as it does now. Like there was no such thing as a wristwatch or a cell phone, right? Or anything that could possibly give you direct access to what actual moment in time that it was. So usually when somebody says something like the 6th hour or like the 3rd hour, depending if it's the Jewish or Roman time scale, they're saying something like morning. They're saying something like midday. So for instance, James, you could say the 3rd hour, which would be 9 o'clock in the morning.
3rd hour after I got up.
Well, no, but you could literally be saying the 3rd hour, meaning earlier on in the day, but in reality, that could be 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Right. So it's kind of like modern Christians reading back into it, a modern exact time measurement that the people writing it would have no knowledge or way to possibly have access to that, right? It's just not possible for them to actually know the exact minute in time. So they're more giving you generalities. So when John is saying the 6th hour and when Mark is saying the 3rd hour, all that really means is that it's a window of time into the first part of the day. That's all that means. So it could literally be like a little bit after sunup to probably just before high noon, or maybe even a little after that, right? So that concept of time does not need to be accurate. And I don't even really view that as a contradiction, right? Because it's only a contradiction if they were all running around with wristwatches and say, no, it was exactly 9:17 in the morning when he was crucified. And then Mark says, well, actually, it's 12:17 or something like that, right?
Right.
In the same way that when the Gospels say they fed 5,000 with the fish and loaves, right? Now, in reality, there were actually 4,812, not including the men, women, and children. So that's actually incorrect, right? We don't have that same. We understand that that's a generalization and doesn't affect inerrancy. It's more of a general numbering, right?
I do wonder how that sort of the rounding theory of interpretation or theory of inerrancy holds to some of the specific numbers. Like sometimes you'll find very precise measurements, and it's like, well, he wasn't rounding to the nearest 10, so is that one like precisely correct? I kind of think the same imprecision actually still holds. It's like in the same way that you could say a dozen. they didn't have a 10 base rounding. So like they didn't have clear rules on exactly how you're supposed to round. And so when someone said even something that sounds like an exact number to our modern ears with modern, scientific notation or whatever, we're not, they weren't counting the number of significant figures when they were stating their measurements. And so I think that even if something is by our modern standards imprecise or inaccurate, that doesn't mean that it would be considered
but like
false or
I don't
inaccurate.
even know if even in a modern context, if you threw an event and you had 197 people in the event room and you said, oh yeah, about 200 people showed up, I wouldn't be like, you liar, James.
Well, no, that would
How
be rounding
dare
up
you?
to the nearest 10. What if you said 196 people showed up and claimed
Sure.
that was an inerrant statement, right? And it was actually 197, right? That's not a rounding thing. That's you stating a precise answer, and it was actually a different precise number,
Right. And that would be a different claim, though. Like I said, if they claimed a precise minute of the day or something like that, that would be incorrect. But I mean, is there an example?
I think
there an
there are
example you
some.
have
I think there are
like
some
a
in scripture that do seem to be
number?
more precise, that they aren't just sort of like general rounding, and are suspect for certain reasons. I don't have a particular example.
Well,
right
I mean,
now,
it's
but
also
there are
possible that
some.
there's like more typological references too, which I would be interested to talk about that because it's like,
Was the
Noah's
number
Ark
picked out for a particular reason?
Well, right. Noah's
I'll
Ark,
give you one
40
example.
days, 40 days in the desert for Christ, 3 days in the belly of the whale, 3 days crucified.
14 generations in Matthew's genealogy, right? There's 14 generations. He breaks it into 3 sets of 14, and then he gives sort of a theological explanation for why this is significant. And it's clear when you actually compare his genealogy to some of the other genealogies that he's leaving out some. He's sort of skipping some here and there.
Actually is another contradiction that I was looking up today. So Matthew...
Yeah, Matthew and Luke's are very, very different. Yes,
but
that's a separate
they might
thing.
both be accurate because it's very possible that Joseph himself was adopted or was part of a brother marriage or something like that. Basically, where the brother dies and then you take the wife, right? So it's very possible that his father, so he might actually have 2 fathers, he might actually be adopted. So there actually are reasonable
So it's like one is showing one lineage and then the other one is showing more the legal lineage. And
correct. Yeah, because it's like I am technically his son as a legal standing rather than, but I have 2 fathers, right? One that's my legal father and one that's my biological father.
Yes. And Luke has a very interesting phrase, a very interesting parenthetical phrase where it's like his father as it was supposed or something like that, that kind of hints that might be what's going on there. So those genealogies, the Luke and the Matthew genealogy, are just like totally different, which is interesting. But then even if you look at Matthew's genealogy, it's clear that it's not a precise genealogy. Like he's kind of forcing the numbers a little bit to get like 14, 14, 14, or it doesn't. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some people believe that it really is exactly that.
Yeah,
way.
I haven't.
I'm pretty sure most people think that he's kind of playing with the numbers to get the theological point across, which would be more of a question of genre, right? Like, is he doing something that's accepted within this genre of genealogy where he's not trying to be exactly precise, but he's trying to make more of a legal point where it's like Christ was descended from David, and this is why it's significant. Those do not necessarily amount to lies or to even errors, right? In that case, it doesn't seem to be an error at all. It seems to be very intentional, kind of playing with the numbers, perhaps. But you do get sort of these precise numberings where it's not, it wouldn't fit our criteria for being a rounded number, but it still might be fudged a little bit.
Well, it's kind of rounded, right? If you're using a number
7, 14,
purpose. Exactly.
Right. Yeah, you're not doing a 10 base rounding, but doing 7 base rounding, or exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there's other ones. So, like for instance, I think Mark, Luke, and John all use slightly different phrasing upon the death of Christ when the actual veil in the temple rips. And so, like, a lot of this comes down to language and Greek versus English. So, like, sometimes it's translated dies and then the veil is torn, or it's the veil is torn and then. So every single one of them is like right before the exact moment of or directly after. And so the way that you would orient this is like which one you're emphasizing more than like an actual like linear time scale.
Maybe it tore over a period of 2 hours, and it was, maybe it took a long time for it to tear.
Maybe it was. Maybe
it's
who
possible,
says it was an instantaneous tear? It could have taken a long time.
Or Peter, when the rooster crowed, one gospel says, Peter, you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows, and then another one says, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And so some people will say, well, that's a contradiction. Others will say, well, maybe he denied him 6 times, and 3 times before crowed once, and then another 3 times. Most Christians that I've heard would say, well, a rooster has to crow once to crow twice, right? So maybe, one is simply emphasizing the fact of the rooster crowing, and the other one is being a little more precise about the rooster crowed twice before Peter completely denied him. So that one seems like a very weak contradiction. Like that's barely even a contradiction.
Now I'm curious about this one. So this one was actually one that I hadn't ever heard of before, I think. So Jesus cleansing the temple.
Yeah. John has it at the very beginning of his ministry.
Well,
whereas
no.
the
But the theory is, and apparently the early church believed this, that Christ cleansed the temple twice.
Yeah.
And I had never thought of that before.
Yeah, because John puts it at the beginning of his ministry, and then all the synoptics say he did it basically to kick off Holy Week. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it actually is plausible that it is, because the accounts in John are different in terms of not just the imagery, but some of the things that he does. Like at the beginning, it's in John's gospel, it's much more aggressive. It's much more explicit in how like angry Christ is. And then this kind of kicks off his mission in Jerusalem. And then he comes back and then basically does it again at the end of his mission as well. Right. There's other theories that it's like John is topological, not linear in his storytelling. So he's telling you in order of most important, although that doesn't really make sense because it still ends with the crucifixion. So I feel like if it was truly topological, you're going to start with that and then move it down. But that is, twice. Twice is interesting. I've never heard that before.
That's one of the few ones where I kind of accept that as a potentially reasonable option, where like, oh, maybe it just happened twice, when you have like 2 very slightly different descriptions, but it seems like they're talking about the same story, but the text clearly says it happened at a different time, and so it seems like a contradiction. And then the easy answer is, oh, maybe it just happened twice and it was slightly different in both these times. A lot of times that doesn't quite do it for me. It seems like a bit of a cop-out, but in this case, it's like, yeah, he could have cleansed it twice. That doesn't seem like an issue.
Well, I had heard the argument that, well, if he had cleansed the temple and kicked people out, they wouldn't have let him back in. But that doesn't make sense in either story, because they let him back in
with a bullwhip
the first time he did it. Or the second time he did it, right? If you think that it only happened once at the end, they still let him back in after he had cleansed the temple.
Right. So
right. Yeah, probably a reference that it needed a deep cleaning. It's true.
That's right. All righty. Yeah, I don't. When I do a cleaning around the house, I also carry a whip, but that's not to.
That's to make sure that the house cleaners do their job, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like when my dishwasher's acting up, I usually spank them, but that's
right.
different.
Christian, you wouldn't know anything about that, would you?
Thank goodness, not yet.
I don't know.
Thank goodness. What do you mean? It's fun.
All right.
Well,
this is good fun, guys. No, I was just going to say that I think this has been fun. I do apologize for monologuing more this stream than usual, but hopefully it was helpful. And I've been doing a decent amount of research and reviewing of these concepts, and so I just wanted to share it in somewhat scattershot form, but hopefully it tied together in a way that was consumable, and it's given you enough, as my mom would say, coat hangers to hang future information on, so where you kind of have these terms in your head, and you can, as you hear them again, or as you run into Schleimacher or Boltman, you'll kind of be like, oh yeah, I've heard that name before. What did he do again? And you can kind of look it up, and then you'll remember it the next time because you have that coat hanger for the first. So anyways, I hope that's what this has done for you. And at some point in the future, we will do a deep dive into inerrancy as well. And I do think that'll be less lecture-based. I think that really will be interesting. There's a particular letter from C.S. Lewis that I think would be really interesting to do a bit of a deep dive on. And yeah.
I read all that stuff, and we're not even going to go over it.
Oh, we'll go over it in the future. Don't worry. We'll get to it. But good deal. Christian, you've been kind of silent. Any closing thoughts before we wrap this up?
Yeah, sure. I think you have to be kind of careful with biblical scholarship. I think it does have its uses. It can be used well in debates against like atheists and whatnot. But I don't know. I think it could be dangerous. I think that it could biblical scholarship can be used as a master as opposed to like as like a church or something. But I mean, even in the Orthodox Study Bible, you see biblical scholarship all over the place with footnotes and whatnot. But I think there's great saints and great monks throughout history who have been pretty much like illiterate, and they could have sermons or have knowledge about God that could make Harvard theologians weep. Like, right. I don't know. Yeah. So I don't know. That's my closing remarks. You have to be careful with it.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely agree. John, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of in Christian's boat with that as well. I think it can be very useful when you're running up against an atheist who has some of these like really low level critiques, right? And that's what a lot of this stuff just kind of bores me. Like if you're not saying that you were boring, James, but I'm just saying like if you're presupposing, well, if you're just presupposing a purely material world, then yeah, of course, like the Bible doesn't make any sense. God doesn't make any sense. Like, of course, right? But once you're outside of that materialist paradigm, I think, you know, that's the world that we live in, right? So if they're like, oh, well, there's no first century Roman historian that tells me exactly the date that Christ was crucified on, therefore I don't care. Like I'm never like they can set a standard so high that it's not possible for you to achieve it, basically, right?
Well, a point I didn't even make is that one of the biggest assumptions is an anti-supernatural bias. All of these critical scholars, I mean, not the explicitly Christian ones, but kind of the ones who are coming at it from like a historical perspective as opposed to a theological perspective are going to have an anti-supernatural bias, and that's going to rule out, you know, any of the stories that involve miracles, right? It's assumed that those aren't historical because they can't be.
Oh yeah, I mean, you're presupposing everything in there is a lie. Or I should say, the vast majority of it is a lie. The only thing you're even possibly concerned with is like perhaps the historical figure of Christ and the apostles, right? Maybe some of the Old Testament as like Jewish folklore about their own history, maybe, but that's literally all that it can be to you, right?
But
so
of course,
this doesn't.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, this doesn't, like, for me personally, is it interesting to learn this stuff on like if I was going to talk to an atheist or somebody against it? Like, yeah, of course this stuff is a good tool in the tool shed. It's a good hanger for ideas in the future to kind of build off of. So I think this is stuff that you should have at least a fundamental understanding of for when you run up against it. But this isn't like something that the average layperson needs to devote a lot of their time to. There's so many more useful things for, you know, your personal growth, your personal journey that you should be devoting your time to. You know, this shouldn't be for everybody, basically, you know.
Ultimately, right. Christianity is a religion based on spirituality and growing your spirit closer to Christ, not being an expert on the Bible. So,
and I think the final thing I'll say is that if Christ really was God made man, God incarnate, who was a supernatural being capable of doing miracles, then this historical Jesus we've constructed on anti-supernatural critical grounds is not the true historical Jesus. This is not. It has really no relation, and it does not look at all like the real person who walked this earth if Christ really was who Christians say that he said he was. And so you're at great risk of completely missing the actual person, right? Which is what you would expect. If you only retain 18% of his sayings as being legitimate, then you're going to be left with a very pale version of the real thing. Thank you all for being here, guys. This has been a good time. Thanks to everyone. I think by next week we should have our super chats back up, which will be good. And thank you to all of you who've subscribed. I think we are now over the 1,000 subscriber mark, which is awesome. John, Christian, thank you for being here. Everyone, have a good night. God bless.
Good night, gents.
Good night. God bless.